just go initially, and we'll have you introduce yourself.
I'm Father Joseph Aboud. I'm the pastor of St. George Orthodox Church in Flint Township, Flint, Michigan.
Okay. All right. And where were your parents from?
My dad was born in Argentina, but his parents were from Lebanon. They had migrated to South America. So he had 13 brothers and sisters. They were all born in South America. Mm-hmm. And my mother was born in Pennsylvania. Her mother was born in Pennsylvania. And her father was born in Syria.
Okay. Okay.
So I'm kind of third, fourth, whatever generation.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any like roots or context still with like anybody in South America, or?
Yes, I had my dad's. He had the 13 brothers and sisters. The oldest girl was married at the time of my grandfather's passing. And when my grandfather passed, my grandmother had a brother in Detroit. Mm-hmm. And the brother had gotten a hold of her and said, come and bring the kids and, we'll help you and take care of you and whatever. My dad at the time was only 12, so he was pretty young.
Right, okay. All right, your parents, were they, as a whole, very religious at all?
Yes, my dad's family were Roman Catholic with the Maronite Rite, which is in Lebanon. I don't know if, I wouldn't say it's a majority, but it's a lot of the Christians in Lebanon are of the Catholic Church, this Maronite Rite. And then my mom's family was Orthodox, and they were very active also.
Okay, and around what time did they move? Like what years or time frame?
Moved to the States?
To the States, right.
My mother's grandfather came in the 1910s.
Okay.
In that area because he fought in World War I as American citizen. My father came in I want to say the 30s or 40s. Okay. I'm not exactly sure when that was.
Okay, okay.
But in that area.
What did your grandfather do in World War I?
I don't know, he's a soldier, I guess.
Soldier?
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, they have pictures of him with, kind of his outfit and
yeah, just like
carrying a gun, so.
Right, right.
I don't think he was like doing KP or anything like that.
All right, and where were you born?
I was born in Detroit, and I have a brother and a sister. I'm the oldest.
Okay, and how do you say like you were raised in terms of like morals or just in general? Like, was your parents have any kind of like strict guidelines they have you follow, or?
Well, yes. Both my parents, because of their religious upbringing, and I was born in 1958 and grew up in generally the 60s and 70s. So there was, back then it's a different time than now.
Absolutely.
But at least back then, because of my parents and their own values, we were church people, we went to church. And, there were rules, regulations. I got grounded a lot. My mom, my parents, had, the discipline at that time. Mm-hmm. They didn't have a problem hitting you and whatever, and so that's kind of how that worked.
Right. So, did you go to a public school in Detroit, or? I
did. I grew up in East Detroit. It's called East Point right now. And I went to the elementary school and the middle school then, junior high at the time. Mm-hmm. And then my parents moved when I was starting high school to Grosse Pointe Woods, and I graduated from Grosse Pointe North High School. Okay.
And how was the quality of the schooling there in Detroit at the time?
In East Detroit, I guess it was fine. I mean, I think I had a good education.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
So then, do you identify yourself as an Arab American?
Yes.
Okay. Do you ever find like a clash in identity between the two?
No, between being American and being Arabic background?
Exactly.
I wouldn't say a clash. I think it's, for many people of Middle Eastern descent, it can be difficult in living in America because you were mentioning values and that kind of thing.
Right.
And the values and norms, and besides it just being different, because I think it's different in the Middle East also now in the 21st century. besides it being different here in America or in the West in general, I think, standards are different. So that's for those that have values or have a religious upbringing, I think it can be difficult because there's those conflicting kind of value systems.
What kind of values would you say like really conflict?
I would say off the top of my head, nowadays, kind of sexual things is pretty, in America, is pretty, you can't drive down the freeway and you see half-clad women or whatever selling whatever they're selling. When I grew up in the 60s and 70s, I mean, obviously there was that kind of sexual revolution going on here in America, but still we grew up, with not, with the right thing, not having premarital sex, extramarital sex. There were taboos, with if it wasn't a heterosexual relationship, where nowadays things are a little bit more, things are just a lot more different.
Absolutely.
So even though my values and those of the church are very much, still kind of heterosexual, sex only in marriage, it's very difficult because with our children growing up in this society, because it's very promiscuous, I guess I would say.
Okay. And then I guess back to you. Where did you get your bachelor's and master's degrees?
I grew up in the Detroit area, so I started, after I graduated from high school, I started at Wayne State University, and I went there for a little bit. I went to Oakland University, and I had about, altogether, after a year and a half, about a semester worth of credits that transferred, and then I moved to New York myself, and I went to school. I lived at the seminary, St. Vladimir's Seminary, which is just north of New York City in Yonkers. And I lived on campus, and then I commuted to a local college where I ended up getting my bachelor's in social work.
Okay. And then you got your master's in...
Then I took a year off, got married, lived in San Francisco, loved San Francisco. But we were there for a year, my wife and I. And then we moved back to New York, and then I got my Master's of Divinity. That's a graduate school. The seminary is considered a graduate school.
Okay.
And I got my Master's of Divinity after 3 years, and my first 2 children were born there.
Okay. So you said you loved San Francisco, so did you like New York as well, or?
I didn't like New York that much. I was growing up in Detroit, you're a car guy.
Exactly.
And New York wasn't built for having cars.
Okay.
So I had a car, and if I ever went in the city, you had trouble finding parking and all that kind of thing. New York is just a huge city. I thought Detroit was a big city until I moved to New York.
Yeah.
And I was there for over a 7-year period. And it was just way too many people. The cultural stuff is nice. I mean, it's New York City. But just it's way too many people for me. So I would enjoy coming back to visit in Detroit. My wife's family was from Los Angeles, which is pretty big, but it's more spread out in LA. So it's not like everybody's living on top of each other.
Like in New York.
Right. And we're in San Francisco, it's just not that big of a city. I mean, it's kind of spread out, but the city itself of San Francisco, it's kind of contained by the bay and the ocean and whatever. And it was just, so it was beautiful there. We both, my wife and myself, are blessed to be here in the Flint area. We've been here since 1988, going in 27 years. But we love the size, we love the community, both the Orthodox community, the Arab American community, and then just the society in general here in Flint.
All right. As a whole, do you think that the Arab American society has like a stronger connection here in Flint or in this Dearborn area than it does in, say, Los Angeles or New York?
Yeah, I would say that, Detroit, growing up in Detroit, I knew a lot of Arab Americans. At that time, though, most of them were Christian background. If they had any religious affiliation, most of them were Christian background. I was not that familiar with growing up with, like, Muslims, as an example. But because of like the difficulties in the Middle East and all the different countries there had been more, over the years, more immigration into this country from the Middle East, both of Christians and of Muslims. Detroit it was, I don't know if it still is, the largest concentration of Arabs in America. And Flint had a good size, according to its population, a good size of Arab Americans here in Genesee County. So, and again, I think there's been a lot of, at least in my parish, St. George, after the second Intifada, which was in Palestine, Israel, after the second Intifada, there was a number of people that moved to Flint. And namely, they moved here because there was other people from their city or relatives or whatever that they knew. That's kind of just a normal immigration pattern. But that's kind of dried up now, even though there's still issues over in the Middle East. A few are trickling into Flint, but it's not like it was.
Okay.
And a lot of that is just because the economy here isn't what it was either.
Right.
So when people are going to come to the United States, they'll go to somewhere where they can help raise their family and, get a, middle class job or business or whatever, and they can support themselves. And that more and more it's difficult to do that here in Flint.
Exactly.
We lose a lot of our college kids from the parish. They go to graduate, and then it's difficult finding jobs, and then they have to go and work,
Exactly.
And in years past where people might go into the family business, the businesses that families have in our parish, they're not as strong as they used to be for our college educated kids to stay around to work in those family businesses. So we have a lot of kids that move anywhere else just to find a job. I have 3 children. One of my children, my second son, lives in Boston. He's working there.
In Boston?
Yeah.
Okay. What did he do?
He graduated from Michigan State with a bachelor's in English, which was pretty, to get a job, useless. So he ended up getting his master's in education. So he's basically had been looking for a high school English teaching job. There wasn't much here. He had a high school friend that was teaching English in high school in Chicago. He moved to Chicago. He lived there for a year and a half, and just because of the situation in not just public education, in schools themselves, it's difficult to get a job in any kind of school. Absolutely. So he ended up being offered a job in Boston as a youth director at one of the Orthodox churches there in Boston, St. George in West Roxbury, which is like a suburb of Boston.
Okay. And then I guess going right back to you, what made you interested in getting a master's in divinity, becoming a father?
I grew up in the church. I was very active in our teen group, kind of in the church, and there were a number of adults that were an influence on my life, and I always thought that it would be fun to be a priest. So I had a lot to learn, but I always had that kind of innate desire that I would, of course, give that inspiration from God. But that kind of innate desire to be a priest. Early on in my college years in Detroit, I wasn't doing things to kind of reach that particular goal. And then I was encouraged to just go to the seminary and get my bachelor's out in New York. And that's what I ended up doing, and then the master's, and very quickly, the little I thought about being a priest, I learned a lot more. And then I wouldn't say it's so much fun, even though I have fun. I wouldn't say it's so much fun as much as it's very serious business, but I enjoy it very, very much.
Going back to your parish, how do you say your parish affects the community in Flint or the surrounding area?
Well, I think any parish, they have their parishioners, the people that belong to the parish, and from what they get in terms of values and principles and how to live a good life, at least according to the church or whatever religious affiliation they belong to. They carry that with them in themselves, so when they're working, when they're doing civic duty, whatever it might be, that kind of spreads out that way. We're blessed in our parish. We have a number of professionals, lawyers, doctors. We have a judge. One of the judges here in Genesee County is from our parish. And they're very, very well respected individuals. They grew up in this area, and as difficult as the economy has been, they love this area and they try to do the best for this area.
Okay. Do you have any collaboration with other churches or parishes in the area?
We do have collaborations we have 3 other Orthodox churches in Genesee County that we do lots of things together. I belong to, when I first came to Flint in 1988, I was invited to be in a clergy kind of association. It was called the Apostolic Clergy, and there were a number of all the Orthodox participated. There were a number of Roman Catholics that were part of that, a number of Episcopalians that were a part of that, and some Lutherans that were a part of that. But it was more kind of social group, fellowship group, continuing education group. We would discuss different topics and how our different church traditions would view those topics. But it was a very, being fresh out of seminary, it was a very wonderful experience because you had a chance to interact with those that were Christians, but they didn't have exactly the same faith as you did. So that was a good thing.
Okay. And then outside of the church, do you have any membership with any affiliations or? I'm
very active, I should say very active. I'm very involved and very supportive of the work of the Arab American Heritage Council. Again, when I came in 1988, they were just kind of getting their feet off the ground, and we still have many parishioners that are a lot more actively involved in terms of being on the board of directors and working for the good of the Arab American community here in Flint. And it's important to say, I think, that the work of the Arab American Heritage Council isn't just for its own people, even though that's kind of the main thrust, I would say, but to help the community also, and especially in helping the community understand better the Arab Americans, and not so much to change people into the culture of Middle East or anything like that, but to be able to understand it better so they can at least appreciate it better. Unfortunately, I think, and I know from growing up in this country in the 60s and 70s, a lot of prejudice, discrimination, with a number of ethnic groups, but specifically with the Arab Americans. It's hard to watch movies without Arabs getting stereotyped as terrorists or whatever it might be.
Right.
But it's so that your normal person growing up in America that's influenced by movies and that kind of thing, they'll get sucked into that wrong stereotype. I would say all stereotypes are wrong, but that particular stereotype of Arabs being of one particular group, religious group, Muslim. Some people here, when I've been here all these years in Flint, and you still run across people that are surprised that I'm Arab, but I'm also a Christian. So that kind of thing. And then, helping people understand the difficulties in the Middle East. It's not as simple as we might hear on the news programs or read in our newspapers. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Okay. Do you think since the 60s and 70s that treatment in terms of Arab Americans has gotten better or has gotten worse in terms?
I think it's different because of the situation in the Middle East. Obviously, as Americans, we have always been involved with having our influence in that region of the world. Sometimes the influence has been good, and of course that influence is just for the interests of America. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good. But I would say over the last 20 years or so, because of the issues going on in the Middle East, the United States, both diplomacy and military action in the Middle East, gives some people some people in America, mm-hmm. False kind of understanding of Arab Americans and where they stand, mm-hmm. where's your loyalties, that kind of thing. So I think that, when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, I mean, there was issues. In the 70s, there was an oil embargo and all this kind of thing. But I don't think Arab Americans were as affected by that then as when things happen now. They're more affected. And of course, things now, something we can see what's going on in the streets of anywhere in the world just through the internet. And obviously in the 60s and 70s, we didn't have internet. We only had 3 TV stations, the network stations. And so, just because society is a lot different and our experiences are a lot different now, causes more news to travel a lot quicker.
Okay. So in terms of media and everything that's happened in the past 13 years, how do you feel like September 11th has played a role in the way Americans as a whole view Arab Americans or Arabs in general?
Right. I think it was a very difficult situation. I mean, it was a tragedy that happened. And it was a tragedy for me as an Arab American living in this country to see that many people terrorized and to die. And not just those people that died, obviously they have families and all those victims of those individuals and the victims of the 9/11 attacks have been difficult to live with as an American. Specifically as an Arab American, it's been difficult because it cemented for many Americans the wrong stereotypes they've seen in movies and wherever they got those stereotypes from. And I think that my own experience, and I would say the experience of my parishioners, is you're constantly trying to inform people that those stereotypes aren't correct, and people that have open minds maybe can learn a little bit. Mm-hmm. Then there's some people that their minds aren't open at all, so you can talk to your blue in the face and it doesn't really matter.
Okay. And then I guess back to the events in the Middle East, how do you feel about the whole events that have happened recently in Syria and just in the Middle East in general? Right.
I think any time when we're not, we're blessed in this country because we generally live in peace. There's always issues going on, so our hearts might not be at peace, but generally we live in peace. We don't have to worry about, people invading our country or people coming, over the border and military, soldiers, whoever, we obviously have this issue of terrorism that today is a lot different than it used to be. And it's a world problem, this whole issue of terrorism. I think the problem in the Middle East, though, the issues that go on in the Middle East affect us more because of the internet and everything. There's that global aspect of things that, again, when I was growing up, we didn't have that global aspect. So things that happen on the other side of the world really didn't affect us that much. Where nowadays, everything affects everything. Because of the global economy, because of the internet, because our world is a lot smaller in terms of people knowing what's going on anywhere in the world. So there's certain, living in America and growing up in a free country, a democratic country, it's been a blessing for those born in this country and for all the immigrants that came here. You know, I mean, our country was founded by the Puritans that came because they were being discriminated against with their religion, and that's why in our Constitution, you know, freedom of religion is like it's a big deal.
Yeah.
And there's always issues of church and state and making sure that the lines aren't, there's times where the lines get blurred, but generally that everything stays in this appropriate spot. In the Middle East, that's had a long history of tribal leaders and some of them dictators and some of them good dictators. They were dictators, but they were relatively good. And then others that were dictators that were relatively ruthless. That complicates things, because I think everybody, in our minds, we want to simply say, well, in the Middle East, what's going on? Well, unfortunately, I don't think you can generalize even that small area of the world, because there's, in different countries, different things are happening, and they affect things differently. So on one hand, when President Bush, the first Bush, went in, because Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1991, whichever year that was, and you know, it was the wrong thing for that country to do, and we stood up, America and of course all the allies at that time, that it was the wrong thing to do. It was a lot more complicated after 9/11, and we went into Iraq under certain presuppositions that ultimately ended up not being true, and then that complicated, I think, our position in the world in general, but then specifically in the Middle East. We've always had policies in the Middle East, America, has always had policies in the Middle East that favored, especially during the Cold War, when the communist Russia itself was very powerful, and you had kind of the Cold War and everything that was happening around the globe somehow trickled down from what was relations between America and the Soviet Union. It wasn't Russia, it was the Soviet Union at that time. So in the Middle East, America was a supporter of this country, Israel, and generally all the Arabs were supported by the Soviet Union. So what was going on in the Middle East was a microcosm of the Cold War going on between America and the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Soviet Union, things changed there, though you know, recently Russia has gained a little bit more power and influence, and so they're very they're trying to spread that influence. We see some of that in the Ukraine. That's not the Middle East, but up in the Ukraine, with Russia taking, you know, Russia just, the issues going on there, but also in the Middle East. Russia is a big supporter of Syria. They've always been a big supporter of Syria. And even though there's a dictator in Syria at this time, for many years, at least for the Christians in Syria, the government was very tolerant of the Christians. So the Christians were very supportive of the government, even though there were things that were very ruthless and things that were done. So when the revolution or whatever going on in Syria over the last 3 years, trying to overthrow the government, the Christians were in a difficult situation because the government was supporting them, and they were, so many people were supporting the government in their fight against the quote-unquote rebels. Even though the rebels, I think, had a lot of valid reasons for wanting change in Syria. But again, it was a very difficult thing. especially when we see the extreme of kind of that revolution just recently in the last 6 months or so with ISIS, the Islamic State situation, where there's no tolerance for anybody except for what people that believe what they believe. Mm-hmm. So they've gone into villages and big cities, city of Mosul, where if the Christians wouldn't become Muslims, they were killed. And the churches were destroyed and all that kind of thing, where, you know, again, for us in America, you drive down, me driving from Flint over here, and, you know, you pass lots of different churches and religions, not just churches. Mm-hmm. You know, here in Flint, or in Genesee County, we have a couple of different mosques. But we live in a peaceful society. We live in a society of laws. We live in a society where we're tolerant, to the best of our abilities, of each other. But unfortunately, in the Middle East and many areas of the Middle East, not just in Syria, but in many areas of the Middle East, that tolerance is not there. And that's where it's a very sad situation that people, going back to originally your question, they can't live in peace. Mm-hmm. And no matter what your religious background, or if you're not even, you know, you could be an atheist, but you have to live in that situation, you're not living in peace. And, you know, in our church, we are constantly praying that God gives peace to the world. Mm-hmm. So in any area of the world where there's not peace, it's a very sad situation.
Do you think that peace can ever be achieved, the notion of peace can ever be achieved in the Middle East, in terms of, you know, the countries getting along with one another, right, or religions, you know, like an assimilation kind of thing, like here, where everyone seems to get along?
I think anything is possible. As Christians, we live with hope that God will grant peace to those people that are struggling now, no matter where it's at. We pray for that. We know God answers our prayers. It would be difficult, I think, to foresee what would happen in the future. You know, 200 years ago, America is trying to break off from Britain, and we ended up having wars and different things that were going on between our two countries. And now we're allies. So who knows down the road? But I think that we always want to be supportive, as Arab Americans and specifically, but as Americans in general. I would hope that our policies, governmental policies and politics, we would all be supportive of helping inspire and do what we can do to give peace to whoever needs it.
Okay. I think that's about all the questions I have. I think we're good.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
God be with you in your project.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was